First of all, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's come here in person, and also the people who are on the live stream, and welcome you to tonight's event. My name is Tom. I'm the current president of the ANU International Law Society, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. Before I go any further, I'd like to first acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land in which we gather today. We'd like to acknowledge their continuing culture and contribution to life in Canberra, and pay respect to their elders both past, present and emerging. Lastly, before introducing our incredible panellists, I'd like to do a quick overview of the structure of tonight's panel. The first half of the event will be a series of general questions directed to the panellists to discuss more about their careers and which pathways they took to get to where they are today. Then we'll move to a discussion on current international law opportunities, focusing on providing advice to current students interested in international law. After which, there will be a series of questions specific to each panellist, discussing their area in more detail. The questions we have tonight are a mixture of those which you have submitted and some of which we thought might provoke relevant, interesting discussions. And while there will be a set period at the end for individual questions, if you feel as though we're moving away from a topic you're particularly interested in, please raise your hand and we'll pause and answer your question. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our panellists. First, to my left, we have Charles Zhan. He's now a leading lawyer in international law. Charles commenced his legal studies obtaining a Bachelor of Law, specialising in Maritime law at the Shanghai Maritime University, followed by a Master's in Economic Law at the University of Melbourne and a JD here at ANU. Following his admission as a barrister and solicitor in the ACT, Charles commenced practicing with Moulis Legal, where he is currently a partner, advising and representing international private and public sector clients on trade, commercial and dispute resolution matters. Specialising in international regulatory and commercial law, Charles is the head of Moulis Legal's China Business Desk and the Diversity and Inclusion Officer of the International Trade and Customs Law Committee at the International Bar Association, and is the Vice President of the ACT Division of the China Business Council. In the middle here we have, who many of you may know, Associate Professor Esmé Shirlow. Following her graduation from the ANU with first class honours in law, Esmé obtained a Master's and a PhD in international law at the University of Cambridge and King's College London respectively. Esmé was admitted as a solicitor in the ACT and commenced her legal practice with the public service, before training as a civil and commercial mediator in England and pursuing a variety of roles with arbitration tribunals, including the International Chamber of Commerce and the International Centre for Settlement and Investment Disputes with the World Bank. As an associate professor, Esmé now teaches and researches in fields of public international law, international investment law, international dispute settlement and arbitration. She's been particularly busy recently with the publishing of her new book, Judging at the Interface, Deference to Domestic Authority in International Adjudication, which has a launch at the College of Law next month on the 6th of May, so please stay tuned for that. Lastly, but not least, we have Bill Campbell, who's currently an honorary professor who commenced his legal studies at the University of Sydney and pursued a Master's at the University of London. Following his graduation, he practiced as General Counsel in International Law and was Head of the Office of International Law at the Attorney General's Department from 1996 to 2018. In this role, Professor Campbell has advised successive Australian governments in all areas of international law and appeared in cases involving Australia before international courts and tribunals, including the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea. In particular, he was the agent and counsel for Australia in the Southern Bluefin Tuna and Volga cases before the International Tribunal of Law of the Sea, and in the whaling in Antarctica case, it's not ideal, for the International Court of Justice. He's also counsel in Australia the questions relating to the seizure and detention of certain documents and data case before the ICJ. Okay, so before we get into the questions, just want to quickly reiterate for our panellists here. There are a number of general questions I'm going to go through here and ask all of you to answer individually. Please feel free to jump in on anyone else's answer if you feel there's something you want to build on or add to. No problems with that. So first I want to start with, outside of the general introductions I've given you, can you talk a bit more about where you got to where you are today? What were your first steps out of university? And was there anywhere in particular you would credit your success? Charles, if you'd be okay to start.
Oh, okay. I was hoping someone else would volunteer. Well, obviously started with finishing up my Juris Doctor here in ANU, which allowed me to actually practice in Australia. and there is a significant event occurred at Debacle that involved me and a friend of a colleague of mine doing JD, buying a beer, and on the way from the bar to the table, she asked me, "Oh, Charles, are you looking for a job?" I was like, "Sure." And then she, just out of was very surprised what came next, because she was working at Moulis Legal as a paralegal, and she was leaving for Sydney, and so that position became available, and she was like, "Oh, we do a lot of international law, and a lot of clients and matters to do with China. Is that something you're interested?" I was like, "You have to be kidding me! This is kind of the perfect opportunity I was looking for." So by all means, you're not wasting your time having a beer with your mate. So they started off there, and then of course I started to realize it's an area of practice that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed the intellectual challenge and the dynamic of interaction with private and public sector clients. I find it difficult to credit the journey to any particular experience or degree. I certainly wasn't committed to become a lawyer before undertaking my second law degree with the JD. I was pretty clear I didn't want to be a lawyer after finishing my Maritime, the bachelor degree in Maritime law. Then went out to try different experience, arbitration, commission for maritime law in Beijing, on the more commercial and logistic side of things that had nothing to do with law, with a commercial airline back then. But I think at the end of the day, all those experiences help you grow to who you are, that ultimately will benefit your contribution and your own practice.
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Can I ask just quickly then, so what motivated your move after studying maritime law in Shanghai over to Australia?
I think the practical sort of incentive was family related. My mom moved to Australia, so I was the only family member, being the single child generation, and also she asked if I want to come to Australia. I think personally I always wanted to explore what's out there. So yeah, and Canberra was actually my first choice. I actually really liked Canberra. I know, right? But I think you'll appreciate more if you grow up in Beijing and then spend a lot of years in Shanghai and being a bit of a rebel. I'm finished with big cities. Canberra is such a beautiful place.
We'd love to hear it. Esmé.
So I guess I kind of came into undergrad at ANU wanting to do international law, but not really knowing what that might look like. I was really put off by the compulsory course. I found it really dry and a bit confusing because it didn't really match up with my idea of what international law might be. And so for a while I kind of hunted around at uni thinking maybe the international law dream was over for me, until I went on exchange and did a whole bunch of international law electives overseas. And so I kind of returned to international law at that point, still not with a very clear idea about what that might look like as a career. At the time I was much more interested in international criminal law and international humanitarian law and human rights law. I, coming out of uni, decided that the public sector really spoke to kind of my interests, and so I applied for various general grad programs and ended up accepting an offer at the Attorney General's department, and my second rotation was through the Office of International Law, where I was put in the trade law team, and a month into that we got filed with the Philip Morris tobacco plain packaging claim under an investment treaty, and the rest is kind of history, because I found then an area of international law I'd never even heard of before I ended up in that work area. It was a very kind of new and fresh kind of area of international law, even for fairly seasoned international lawyers, especially in Australia at the time. And from there, that was a real turning point for me, in that I decided I wanted to practice in international economic law rather than any humanitarian, human rights areas, and I decided to kind of specialise in that area, including by doing the master's program and then the PhD.
Okay, and then now you're here as a professor, and enjoy and teaching and lecturing. And have you found that to be an area of your interest as well? And then you've got that on the side.
It's interesting because, I mean, even before I started in the grad program, I was tutoring through the Jabal Centre at ANU, and while I was doing the grad program, I was still tutoring through that. I got a job as a casual tutor at the law school at that time, decided I quite liked teaching, and I think kind of the practice of international economic law, international law in general, is quite academic, so kind of it spoke to some of my research interests anyway, and it was a logical next step for me to go and do a master's and then a PhD, and from the PhD I decided the best way to combine all of those interests was from academia, where I could research and teach, but I still practice. So it's kind of combined all the things I liked about all the jobs I did along the way.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. We'll tie back to your practice in a little bit later. Bill, I'll ask you to answer.
Yeah, well, I had I've got to say, a fairly mundane path to international law, because I started off as doing smash and crash litigation in Sydney.
Right.
But I did study international law as one of my subjects at law school, and that really started my interest in international law, and that was my favourite subject when I was at law school. So I left litigation for a little while, went to the University of London, studied there, as you mentioned before, and I had one really good teacher sort of inspired me there, who's still alive, believe it or not, called Bin Cheng, who taught air and space law and is written in that area. He's now 104, so litigation, international lawyers last a long time.
It's good to know.
And then I returned to litigation, and then I went to the Attorney General's Department, much like Esmé did, and started off there, and they were good enough to put me in the international law area where I wanted to go, and I stayed there, and I was there for a long time. There's just one thing I'd like to take out of that, though, if I'm looking at good grounding to become an international lawyer. Not everybody follows this path, but I remember Professor James Crawford giving me a couple of hints about how to become an international lawyer. One of them was, the first thing you've got to do is get a good grounding in domestic law before you move into international law, because that really helps you understand the practice of international law. And the other thing he said, which I didn't follow, was that you should have gain a facility with languages, and in particular French. French is still the language of, or one of the two languages of the ICJ and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. So I just thought I'd drop in those two hints. I think he's definitely right about the language aspect of it. And when I went back to the Attorney General's Department, I had a couple of, which is quite important, mentors there. One of whom is still an honorary professor at this university, that's Henry Burmester.
Yes.
So that's having a good mentor in international law is also quite important. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Henry was, for those you don't know, Henry was one of our patrons of the society for a good sort of 8 years, and recently stepped down, but yeah, he's had an enormous impact on the society going forward, so we do appreciate him as well. I'd like to borrow a question out of the section for advice for students then, and build on something you just said there, Bill. You've all have experience studying overseas, and you mentioned before having a domestic understanding. There's a good foundation to build off in order to be a good international lawyer. Would you say that having studied in sort of another jurisdiction, if you will, would that have also benefited your development as practicing international lawyers?
Well, I certainly think when you talking about going to a foreign university.
Yeah. Specifically.
I think it's definitely.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a definite plus, because not only do you get taught international law at the postgraduate level, and and it's a good postgraduate law degree at ANU, but you do get to meet a whole range of people. In my case, you know, if I look at my air and space law class, we had students of 15 nationalities in it, and you talk about their legal systems and how they approach international law, and plus you broaden your horizons in terms of who's teaching you international law. So I think it's a definite plus. So
yeah, okay. Would you, Esmé and Charles, would you say that I have personal interest, would you say that the majority of international lawyers that you interact with in that sort of area, would they have postgraduate or some sort of graduate degree overseas? Or is that, like, is the fact that all three of you have, is that a commonplace view, or is that something that we just managed to randomly select?
I mean, I think it's certainly quite common. Certainly working in the Office of International Law, that was the first time for me I'd really seen a lot of people all together who'd done master's degrees, largely at Oxford and Cambridge, and that was kind of the first time in Canberra I really came across that as a cultural expectation or norm, which made it kind of feel more possible for me to go and do something similar, whereas I maybe wouldn't have considered that if I'd worked in a different area. I guess now in practice, most of the people I'm working with have qualified overseas. I guess the difficulty is a lot of them are working overseas, so not all of them have gone overseas to get qualified. So there's a lot of, say, British people who have gone to British universities. But it is, I think some of the really good advice I got early on was international lawyers can be a little bit snobby about where you've got your degrees, and I think in terms of kind of training and opportunities and the people that you're exposed to, it's always good to shift institutions, whether that's domestically or internationally, because you get a different perspective rather than kind of running through all your degrees at one institution, which might give you good training but not necessarily the breadth of experience and networks that you'd be looking to gain.
Can I just add something to what Esmé just said? She just mentioned two universities, Oxford and Cambridge, both of which I was rejected by. So that I thought that was quite personal. But the other thing I did want to mention is that certainly at the Office of International Law we valued postgraduate degrees, and we supported people financially in doing their postgraduate degrees. And it was much easier to support their postgraduate degrees at Australian universities than foreign universities. And there are at least 3 universities in Australia that I can think of who have very good postgraduate degrees in international law. And many of the staff of the Office of International Law and in Foreign Affairs have done postgraduate degrees. And one of those places is ANU, which has an excellent postgraduate degree. So you do get the experience of being overseas, but we do have good postgraduate degrees in Australia.
And you definitely see that when you're going through like the College of Law website. You just look through the biographies of each of the scholars, and they're just very, very impressive. And especially in the current climate, the overseas study might not be the best option for a lot of the current students here, but maybe that's something to look at down the track. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Ask, what has been the highlight of your career? If you could name one specifically. Charles, if you'd like to start.
I'm still a very young lawyer. It's a hard question for me. I'd like to think the highlights is something in the future. It's a hard question. I think at the start, when I first started with Moulis Legal, and being personally being someone who's a first-generation immigrant from China, knowing that one of the first clients I was going to file I was going to put onto was to give advice for the Ministry of Commerce of China. So that was a bit of a sort of taken back by that, but also felt quite privileged to be in that position to do that level of work. I think on a more light note, there are also cases where we assist the client to go through the dispute system, and including taking to the High Court. As a lawyer, that's always the excitement. But I think on a more personal level, I think the practice of international law which takes you to different places. Again, sorry, it's not happening right now, and meeting people from different walk of life and different corner of the world. That has always been one of the most attractive elements of the practice. There are many, especially with the manufacturing kind of industry client we often represent. It takes you to places in the world that you normally not go. Places like right in the middle of jungle in the Sumatra Island, which I ended up with a very, very bad food poisoning. But yeah, it's, I think it's just making your life more interesting.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's the highlight for me.
No, yeah, I definitely think I see the idea of meeting and interacting with many people of various different cultures as a particular highlight that I think most people would assume of international law, and that's certainly a motivating factor, motivating most people here who are obviously interested in international law into that area. Esmé?
I mean, hard to pick a highlight, I think. I guess kind of front of mind at the moment for me is probably publishing my book, because that to me summarises a lot of what I've done in my career, in that it began as a problem that I noticed, or a gap in the law, way back when I was working on the Philip Morris arbitration claim, and I kind of kept needling at it through just kind of both advices when I was working within that team, but also on my own time, as kind of it started to consume me as an issue that I'd spotted, which was really how international courts and tribunals use domestic decision making, and whether they defer to domestic decision makers and value what domestic decision makers are deciding. And it kind of then propelled me on to think about it as a PhD project, so very academically. But increasingly I've been able to convert the academic research then into kind of principles to guide practice, and at the moment I use it a lot in consulting with investors in investment claims, but also foreign governments, and it's very satisfying to see something that just began as a kind of idle intellectual curiosity in a meeting become a whole kind of research agenda that's now encapsulated in a book, but also is informing my practice and really helping clients, I think, to frame their arguments in a way that resonates with tribunals, and so it's kind of seeing the translation of the academic into practice, from practice into academics, is been really satisfying.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Esmé. Bill, do you have a particular memorable moment or highlight that you would like to point to?
I'll mention three.
Okay.
The first betrays how long I've been around. I was actually a junior international lawyer in the Tasmanian dam case before the High Court, and had to do a lot of the international law research for that. And that taught me a lot, and I really valued that enormously. The second is appearing and running cases before international courts and tribunals with Esmé in the documents case. Pity we didn't win. That's Esmé.
A highlight, right?
And the other one was sort of leading the Australian delegation to the international, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, and justifying Australia's extended continental shelf of 2.65 million square kilometres. I can remember that. But in all that, it's being in the cases and things like that, but it's also, and truly is, working with the people in those cases, and getting to know them, and everybody putting in their own bit in the team. I can say that, if I think of the cases in The Hague, terrific experience, not just appearing before them, but the whole exercise of running a case and things like that. Yep.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that. And so the last of the general questions, can I ask, what has been the most challenging aspect of your career? Like, would you look at a specific point and be like, that maybe that conflicted with my values or was a particular time constraint that I found difficult, and how would you explain that to students in our sort of position as an active sort of part of international law?
I can start off
Bill?
with that. I mean, just to say, I'm looking at the career of a government international lawyer and what you have to do as a government international lawyer. And particularly in the area of legal advice, of which you give a lot of legal advice, as a government lawyer, you really have to give objective legal advice on matters. And that can be quite challenging given the issues that you have to deal with and your own personal views. So, you know, we in the Attorney General's Department had to deal with issues of, there's lots of human rights issues where you wouldn't say that we're, I suppose, always seen as being on the right side. In other words, if there's a communication to the international, under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it's normally that Australia has breached the International Covenant, and it's our job to, if we can, defend that role. Doesn't necessarily we agree with what we're doing, but another example is the whole issue of asylum seekers. So we had to give a lot of international law about advice about that, but it can be very difficult and challenging to put aside your own views when you give the advice on that. So I would say that's a rather big challenge for a government lawyer.
Yeah, okay. No, I can definitely see how that would happen. And also I think that seems to be a general, throughout law generally, as having to be
sure.
in a position
Yeah,
to give advice. But
it does reflect the position in law generally.
Yeah, but also in a sort of a groupthink environment where everyone's going for something particular, I can imagine that would be hard. Esmé? So.
I guess for me it kind of ties back to, I've always really enjoyed working with standout people, and I've been extremely lucky in my career to have had numerous mentors who have really helped me and inspired me in the practice of international law. And I would say, being totally honest, my most challenging moment was in the final few months of my PhD when my supervisor passed away, and he had been also a person I was working for because he was president of quite a few investor state tribunals. He was a judge ad hoc at the ICJ at the time, and he was a judge on the Iran-US Claims Tribunal. So I would say that had a really profound personal impact on me, but also professionally it kind of left me in a little bit of a spin, and academically it was a really difficult time to be grappling with that personally. So I guess kind of the combination of factors and kind of thinking back over my career, it's always around particular people where something goes slightly wrong and you kind of have to pivot and keep going forward in a way that is kind of picking up the pieces as you go and kind of making the best of a very bad situation. So I guess it's usually, for me, it's more about the kind of interpersonal dynamics and those sorts of things rather than kind of pieces of work that I've found particularly challenging.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Thank you for that. Charles?
Oh yeah, I can definitely relate to what Professor Campbell was saying, which I would put to, it's a challenge for all lawyers. One of the most difficult aspects of your practice is client management, whether it's a government or a private sector client, and that's both from just getting a client on board. How do you actually sign up to a client, part of management, but then the ongoing operation, and then where there's you may have a strong opinion from a technical and professional perspective of how what's the best way of looking at things or best approach, and that may be different. Your client might not agree with you. and but I guess that's part of being lawyers, being a good lawyer's attributes, which is the advocacy goes towards externally and internally, and how if you can't convince your client, obviously you can't carry out instructions. I think the other thing, especially in the trade law area, which is kind of in that, I didn't realize we have probably have a lot in common with Esmé. In the trade law area, which is, it's not the public international law with the capital P. It's an area that's really in the intersection because the economic activities are carried out by the private sectors normally, but then there's a strong interface with policy, with politics, with international relations, quite often when you get to a point where the issue involved is quite systemic in nature, the black letter lawyer side of you can get quite frustrated, that you just can't get the points through, or you just can't make what you might think a simple legal point across, because there are other very rightfully complicated and policy considerations interfering in that process.
Yeah, okay. I understand. Thank you for that. So now moving on to some more of the student advice tailored questions. So I think we're going to go with the generic sort of first one here. Have you ever been presented with an application, a student resume, CV, that sort of thing, and particularly tailored to an international law career or avenue? Is there any of those that would particularly stood out, and if so, why? What tips can you give to current students drafting those sort of papers and those sort of applications at the moment? Charles?
I think why it depends on the level of the entry point that you're looking at. Obviously, from a law firm perspective, we will be looking for different attributes and credentials. Depends on the level of lawyer that's being recruited. But I think definitely, if you want to impress and if you really want the position, show your genuine interest. I think being genuine is most important, and to tailor your application, whether it's in a cover letter or showing through in your resume, how your interests relate to the position that you're applying, and make it more customized and specific to the job that you're applying for. I think going back to what we said earlier about more diverse experience and education, whether it's educational experience or work experience in a different jurisdiction, I think that's something that equip you with better perspective of life and practice, and that's something that would definitely be taken notice of.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. Esmé?
Yes, I think it's really helpful to tailor it to the job, and that kind of comes into thinking about how to respond to selection criteria and how to frame your CV so it's telling a narrative about a long-standing interest in, say, international law through your activities or your courses or your employment positions, but then also kind of a narrative that means that the job that you're applying for is really the next logical step in a trajectory into wherever you're kind of looking to go. So I think it's really important to be applying for roles that I guess you're passionate about, because that genuinely comes through when you're applying, but it also means that probably all the things you've been doing beforehand and the things you'll do after will naturally speak to that role and make you a really good candidate for the role. You don't want to shape yourself to fit into something that you don't really want, because that will be obvious based on all the activities you've done up to the date of applying for the job. So I think sort of thinking of your CV and any kind of cover letter is really just a narrative about your life that's kind of naturally taking you into that role and making it very clear to the person reading both the cover letter and the CV that you really understand what the role is, but you're a really good fit for that role at the same time.
Thank you, thank you. Bill?
I agree with a lot of what has been said. To me, it's not so much how the resume is presented, you know, but it's the substance of what's in the resume that's there. Obviously, if there are selection criteria, it is very important, particularly in the public service, to address the selection criteria. We had one person who applied, started off by saying, I'm not going to address the selection criteria, but, you know, that sort of thing doesn't work really. But to me, I've always, I know this sort of gets to the substance and not the presentation, but I've always valued very good academic results. So if you've got them, I'd definitely put them forward. And something was said earlier, application that evinces a really deep interest in international law and wanting to pursue a career in international law, and good references. I know it's not in the application, but good references help. The one thing, if I can just mention something slightly off the question, but it's about getting a job in international law. Whatever you do, don't give up after you miss out on the first, second, third or fourth job, because international law can be a very difficult area to get into it. But once you sort of get your foot in, it's easier to move from one place to another. But don't sort of think, I didn't get my first job, maybe I'm not suited to it, and give up at that point. You've really got to keep on going and applying for the jobs.
And you might have to there be a little bit flexible in that the entry points aren't necessarily as clear as they would be if you're going into domestic law. So you might need to be a bit creative and flexible with where your entry point will be, and then it's about kind of shuffling incrementally towards a bigger goal, but you might not nail that the first job that you get, and that's quite common amongst international lawyers. Is often it takes a few attempts, and you have to kind of work through areas that will teach you valuable skills or introduce you to valuable people, but won't necessarily be your ideal ending point in where you're wanting to go.
I have a quick question just leading from that. Are there any jobs or workplaces in particular that you can think of that might not be something that we clearly think like, oh, this is, you know, a really great entry point into international law, but might actually be through a kind of roundabout way?
Well, there are various opportunities there, such, if I'm looking domestically, such as, and I know people certainly did them in the Office of International Law and Foreign Affairs, before people graduate, internships at the Foreign Affairs, where, you know, I can think of one good example. I have an internship that is based in the mission in New York, and I dealt with a couple of the interns there. They were there for 2 or 3 months, but they had a terrific experience, and at least two of I know have stepped on from there and moved on to other things, moved on to other positions in international law. There's also positions at summer clerkships at the Attorney General's Department, which deal with the Office of International Law. You might know of these already, and also international organisations have internships that people can go to. For example, I met an Australian who had an internship at the Law of the Sea, UN Law of the Sea office for 3 months. So those sorts of opportunities are there. You've got to look for them, and they provide a good starting point, I think, and they certainly look good on a resume.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you for the question. Thank you for your response there. So I hear that you're talking also about looking extensively for domestic opportunities, but also international opportunities to internship in New York and that sort of thing. One thing I'm particularly interested in is, and this comes to you, Charles, I've found, and this might not be everyone's experience, but with especially ANU law and sort of the earlier years, there's a lot of emphasis on public law as the main international law forum that's sort of an opportunity to go into as a profession. So I turn to you, Charles. So you work in private international law as a partner of Moulis Legal. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about some of the opportunities and pathways available in the private international law sector and sort of how they may interact with grad programs and clerkships, if that is as similar as it is in public sector as it is in the private?
I think we discussed this earlier. I think sometimes it could be a bit of a misnomer to say, for example, what my major practice area is. The trade law is a private international law. The private international law tend to have a specific meaning that has to do with conflict of law, and sometimes, especially with my first training, maritime lawyer claim maritime law, shipping law is the only living practice, private international law practice. And that is definitely an area that's quite active, and a lot of arbitration lawyer. That's probably can be qualified as a private international law practice. Trade law is probably, I think, my area. I'll probably say it as international law in the private sector, or a private practice of international law. I think I don't see it as mutually being exclusive from starting your career from a public sector, or starting from private and then going to public. In ANU, I think if I had the opportunity to choose again, I would definitely have chosen. There used to be a subject on international organization. That also open up opportunities to visit those organizations in Geneva and other places. I think that's actually a great introduction to that system and what's out there, what's available. I think going back to what Professor Campbell was saying earlier, a lot of times it comes down to starting, being finding your foundation. Establishing a foundation as a good lawyer, that I think it's probably easier to have that experience in either a combination of international law practice and more pure domestic practice. Where I know people whose practice in, for example, competition law, private or work with HCCC, to then go on to international organizations like the OECD and other places. So there's definitely a pathway, and if you look into it.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Would you say that we want to practice international law in the private sector as you've described here? Are there any particular large employers in that area that you name off the top of your head who, could be a good idea for students to look for grad opportunities with?
Well, I think once you broaden the concept of international law and in the private practice, then I think what you should be looking for is all the either boutique firm like ours and larger firms that has international practice, and you'll be trying to a major focus on international client. And that would be the kind of team that you would be trying to get into. That would then create opportunities for you to, either it's a valuable opportunity in itself for practicing international law, or helping you to meet the right person, right connection.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I just say, there seems to be an issue of categorization here. I mean, I think it's very difficult to categorise one area as private international law and one area as public international law, because frequently the two are mixed. What Esmé might call private international law, I might call public international law. So I think one has to be careful about that. I mean, if I was looking at pure sort of areas of private international law, I'd look at the so-called Hague Conference on International Law or UNIDROIT or something like that. For me, not so much running trade law cases before a tribunal. I'd sort of say that's, to me, that's public international law.
Yeah.
But just to make that point, but the second thing, and Esmé is more of an expert on this than I am, there are, particularly overseas, many private law firms who specialise in providing services in public international law and running cases, public international law cases, including before the International Court of Justice. And there are a couple in Australia. And there are also, to a lesser degree, barristers in Sydney and Melbourne, where one of their specialties is the practice of public international law, including in tribunals, and but also applying international law in Australian courts and there's lots more international law domestically practiced in Australian courts these days, and a lot of people realise, and there are people at the bar who specialise in that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. That's a good clarification there. Esmé, I mentioned before that I was keen to come back to it, but in your bio for the College of Law, it references that you maintain a practice in international law. Would you be able to expand on that, and what does that entail?
Yeah, so it basically means I hold an unrestricted practicing certificate, so I practice as a sole practitioner, registered in the ACT, but able to kind of assist on cases internationally. And really kind of what that line is describing is that I'm still very engaged in the practice of international dispute settlement in particular. I work with barristers and also firms largely out of the UK, but also America, that are working in public international law, as Bill is saying, and I come in basically as a independent legal advisor or consultant on those cases, and my role will vary. So for some of them, I'm just kind of a member of the team, and I'm kind of doing what you would do in a firm, or what you might do at the bar. In others, I'm offering specific advice on particular issues that come up in the case. So like a good example is my book is about deference, and I've obviously been researching that for many years. So often I'm approached to advise specifically when an international claim relates to decisions that domestic courts have made, and kind of trying to then draft pleadings on that issue for a tribunal that the team will then plug into the main submission that they're making. But as I say, it can also be that I'm working across a full case. So earlier this year, I had a remote hearing where I was doing what I would do if I was fully in practice, in that I was drafting cross-examination questions and closing submissions and kind of going across evidence and things like that. And it's a nice thing in academia is you get a bit of flexibility to do that. So we have a policy at the ANU that lets us still maintain those sorts of links to practice, because it's all quite kind of informs the academic research, and the academic research informs the practice.
Yeah, so that ties into something I was going to ask, that because my interaction with you has, or most of us have, probably been primarily in the academia sort of field. What sort of percentage would you say you split between the sort of academia and this practicing?
So it's roughly 1 day a week that I practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is that a quite a general, like, do a lot of people in your position who have who are engaged with academia have similar types of practice?
So I think it's less common in Australia, but certainly there are very good international law academics, particularly in Sydney and in Melbourne, who are doing very similar work. In the UK, it's really common, so it's really unusual as an academic in international law to just be doing academic work. So most academics are kind of what they call pracademics, so they're practicing and they're also academics at the same time. And I think it's because of the nature of international law more than any other field of law. It's a very research-heavy field to practice in, so a lot of what you do in practice is very academic in nature, and a lot of what you're doing in academia is quite practical. So I think it's not a big leap to do both at the same time.
Yeah, okay. It seems like the international law, like, as Bill said, once you get your foot in the door, is very flexible in terms of what you can do then, and it's good to see that you can have a balance in academia and in practicing as well. You don't necessarily have to cut off one to do the other. So I wanted to bring back into the academia quickly. In terms of pursuing international law academia, how would you recommend for students in here today who are interested in getting into that, what pathways would you recommend for them?
So it's really hard to advise students to go for an academic job just because there are so few academic jobs, and the sector itself is really hard to crack into, and often it leads to a pretty miserable few years of kind of short-term casual contracts at multiple institutions that don't pay you for the summer holidays. So you've kind of, it's a difficult career path to pick. So I would say probably the starting point would be to make sure that it's really the career path you're wanting, and the way to do that would be to try and engage in academic type activities and see if you like them and see if you're good at them. So that might be while you're at uni doing subjects where you can do extended research papers and seeing if you actually like the process of researching. It might be picking up tutoring roles to see if you like teaching, because most academic jobs will require you to do research and teaching in equal amounts, so it's important that you kind of like and or are good at both. It might be kind of getting your foot in the door of practice, but at the same time kind of doing what I did, which was write on the side on weekends or teach at night, and sort of see which passions take hold, and then it would be going through postgrad and picking postgrad really strategically to land where you want to in academia.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So, noting the time, I'd like to go for one more question before we move to questions from the audience generally. Is there an area of international law that is currently growing in significance or is of particular interest to you that may be an area that students like us haven't heard about, or in particular could be an area of employment for future professional development applications and things like that? Charles, if you'd like to start.
All right. I mean, I think I can definitely relate to what Esmé was saying. You know, it's an area of law that's constantly changing and developing, and you know, there's a lot of people spend a lot of time, doing academic research, but also a lot of practitioners. You really have to be keeping an eye on what's happening in major jurisdictions and in the international courts to stay on top of the game. I think one of the misconceptions that I was led to believe when I was studying was, it's international law, it's really just for the government, it's not enforceable, it's not real law. That's definitely not the case. As you can see, there are 3 lawyers at least here, all had a very long time of practice in that area. I think my own area, trade law, that's pretty topical. It's kind of in a way sad and kind of worrying to see how increasingly, even though it's being sort of engaged and used a lot, but at the same time there is a bit of a deterioration in terms of the rules-based system. You have the WTO's what they call the jewel on the crown, being the appellate body, being dysfunctioned by the U.S. blockade on the appointment of appellate members. So in terms of practicing the rule of law, there is a kind of going back, but maybe it's an opportunity for something new to be created and for new life to be injected into that sphere of international law. Maybe another area to definitely keep an eye on is climate change and climate law. You have with the EU pushing for their New Deal on trade that's heavily climate and emission focused, and you have new U.S. president that seems to be having some renewed interest in dealing with climate change. I'm sure there's a lot of work, both commercially and academically, that's required.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Esmé.
So I think if you're thinking about practicing international law, a really good way in is actually investment treaty arbitration, and I'm slightly biased in this, but it's a really kind of booming field, and a lot of private sector firms are involved in it, and because of the potential number of claimants, it's more than just states, so the number of kind of companies or individuals that are empowered under treaties to claim against governments means that there are a lot more cases in that area of law than there are in other areas of public international law. And kind of thinking back to the question about unique entry points into it, a lot of firms that practice investment treaty arbitration also practice international commercial arbitration, which is arbitration between two companies, usually under a contract or domestic law, but the procedures are so transferable between the two that there are just many more entry points into the field than there are for kind of really purely public international law state-to-state type claims or proceedings. And so I think for students thinking about careers in international law, that's quite a good entry point that then can push you through into kind of more state-to-state traditional type claims if you're wanting to practice in a dispute settlement type field.
I come to it, well, my role in international law has always been a generalist international lawyer. In other words, covering the field of international law. And I know that there's a tendency towards specialisation these days, but I'll put in a plug for the generalists and say, particularly in government law, somewhere like the Office of International Law, that it's important to have generalists there who can cover most areas of international law, because the questions aren't confined to one area of law or another. They come from all fields. So, and I look at some very good generalist international lawyers who practice in the area of trade law, like the James Crawfords of these worlds, or you look at most of the people who constitute the so-called international bar, bar are generalists, but they can also work in particular areas. So I suppose my hope is that not everybody specialises, but some people look across the spectrum, and there are positions, particularly in government, that do just that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. You, Bill, Esmé and Charlotte, has been really insightful opinions there. I'm now going to open up to the audience for anyone who would like to answer any questions specifically at any of our incredible panellists here. If not, we can go on with a couple more of these questions, or open up to there's some food and drink outside, which we'll move to as well. So, has anyone in particular got any questions for our panellists here?
I guess I know you're working on the yearbook at the moment, Esmé, and obviously the focus of that is how COVID is impacting international law, and you mentioned it yourself. Are you guys worried for the future of international law? Like, obviously there's a greater inclination towards ignoring rules than ever before in a range of different international legal matters. Like, is the discipline genuinely under threat, or is this like just another, I guess, like wave of that happening?
I would probably say it's not under threat from COVID necessarily. And I mean, it's been called a disciplining crisis, so it's perpetually under threat in its own eyes. I think probably the biggest challenge for international law, at least from my perspective, is reshaping itself to kind of fit a modern world. And when you think about kind of a lot of the structures of international law and the institutions of international law, they were set up at a specific time to reflect a specific balance of power and the interests of specific countries that were instrumental in shaping kind of those structures and institutions. And I think increasingly international law may have to adapt to respond to new voices and new perspectives about what it should be achieving and how it should be structured. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, because I think of law as kind of needing to reflect social realities, and so as global society changes, so too should international law. But I think that depends on perspective. It might be seen as a threat and a real challenge from some quarters, definitely.
Would I be able to build on that question there and direct it to you, Bill? In your 20-year role as the Office of International Law, as the highest officer there, did you see, from an Australian perspective, it change over time and international law and the way it was seen to be done as evolving?
Well, I think a lot of the points that I'd make would be picked up, have already been picked up by Esmé on that, and that's in particular that international law, for a start, is no longer the province of just states. There are all sorts of actors in international law these days, and including NGOs, corporations, international organisations, whereas it used to be more or less simply the province of states. So you have all these other voices that need to be taken into account. You have all these new issues that have arisen now, like climate change is not new, but it's relatively new, and things like cyber and things like that, so they all have to be dealt with. But in terms of developing international law, it has been big, and getting new rules of international law, it is much, much more difficult to negotiate a treaty on a large subject in this area than it used to be in the past. You know, the best example I can give is the Comprehensive Convention on Terrorism, which is a very controversial topic, and the result of that is that it's been in negotiation, I think, for well over 20 years, and the major sticking point is the definition of terrorism. So, but I want to finish by saying is that I don't adhere to the theory that there is a backlash against international law. If that's right, then it's been ever thus. One really bad recent sort of element has been Trump and the Trump administration over that period of years, who was particularly, not just talking about Trump himself, but his administration was particularly critical of international law institutions, and I don't think that helped. But hopefully that's a passing phase, and you know, with the Biden administration going back into climate change and not being so critical of international courts and tribunals, I think things will be only on the improve there. So I'm an optimist in international law, not a pessimist, let me put it that way.
Yeah, no, and we appreciate that. I can only imagine how, as you mentioned before, when your individual interests and the government's or your client's individual interests don't line up, I can only imagine the struggles of the Trump's administration's international lawyers who are trying to act on and pursue his own policy approaches.
I would not have liked to be an international lawyer in a State Department.
Okay, guys, are there any more questions?
I have one more question. Sorry, I feel like I've monopolised the floor a little bit, but I'm really intrigued if you have any thoughts on other, like apart from lawyers, other particular like professions that you work with a lot in kind of the international space, because obviously there's so many people who are qualified in like politics and economics and like so many other areas. Is there anything in particular that is like a useful qualification to have, or just good people to have on side?
One of the joys in working in international cases, but more generally, I think, in the area of international law, is the non-international lawyers that you have to not deal with is not right, but work with. If I look at instances like the fantastic geomorphologists that we worked in relation to the continental shelf, and we had experts in the whaling case, on scientific experts there. They're just terrific to work with. So if I, looking at my experience, if I was going to have a double degree in something, I now would have gone and done science and international law. I mean, it pervades a lot. But my more general point is that there's a lot of interaction between international lawyers and other professions, and it's one of the good things.
Yeah, it's a really interdisciplinary practice area, I think, and certainly on cases it's subject matter experts, so scientists. Economists is probably another really big group of people who have a really useful skill set, particularly in international economic law.
But they're paid more than international lawyers.
They're paid a lot more than international lawyers. But also domestic lawyers. So in all the cases I work on, we always have domestic law experts to advise about the specific kind of legal system which is being challenged internationally. And it goes back to Bill's initial point through James Crawford of it does help to know also a domestic legal system and how domestic legal systems operate to practice international law. But if Bill's doing science, I'd probably go back and do economics.
I think there's a whole range of consultants with all different kind of qualifications out there that's very very active, play their own roles in adding value to their clients' pursuit. I'm sure, and whether that's economist or scientist or just who's happen to have a very strong policy background. I mean, I think the most important other skill apart from law is probably writing. I think as a lawyer, being a good writer is just so valuable. If you're a good writer and a lawyer, you never get bored, and I'm sure you'll be a very good lawyer too.
Thank you so much.
We've probably got one more question if anyone has in particular. You might be able to catch up on us outside if you.
Can I just tell one anecdote?
Of course.
So when we were negotiating the 1997 Maritime Boundary Agreement with Indonesia, the relevant foreign minister at the time was Alexander Downer, and I had to go and meet him in his office with my colleagues, and Tony, the head of the delegation, said, "This is Bill Campbell. He is our lawyer on the delegation." And Downer said to me, "Oh, yes, my father was a lawyer, but I'm an economist." And I said, "Oh, well, that's funny, Minister, because my father was an economist and I'm a lawyer." And then he said, not to be taken aback, at least his family was moving in the right direction.
Can't really respond to that, can you? I did say that. Yeah, right. Thank you for that.
That's all right. I thought I'd fill in the time.
So if we don't have any more questions, or at least in this open forum, then I might close up then. Lily, would you go to the gifts? We'd like to invite you all to thank our panellists for coming in this evening.